He was an editor. And when I say that he was so many persons in one, believe me, he was a great poet, a great essayist, a very successful publisher, a great playwright, and a great literary critic and editor. In fact, he was also responsible in uh, the poetic play, you know, the the kind of movement that happened in the field of plays. And he was one of those modernist writers because of whom we now understand what modernism is. Considered one of the 20th century's major poets, Eliot attracted widespread attention for his poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which was first published in 1915. And incidentally, that is there in your syllabus, which was seen as a masterpiece of the modernist movement. It was followed by some of the best known poems in the English language, including The Wasteland, The Hollow Men, and I purposely included the year within the bracket after The Hollow Men because The Hollow Men is the second poem that you have in your syllabus. So you should know that the first poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, was composed in 1915, and the second poem that you have in your syllabus, The Hollow Men, that came 10 years later. And two other important poems are Ash Wednesday and Four Quarters. He was also known for his 7 plays, particularly Murder in the Cathedral, which is there in the master's syllabus of English under SABU. So you are going to read Murder in the Cathedral later if you do your master's under Sidho Kano Birsa University. And The Cocktail Party. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948 for his outstanding pioneer contribution to present-day poetry. Why is T.S. Eliot a great modern poet? What are the main reasons? There are, in fact, a number of them. In fact, before I start giving you one by one all the important points that I have assembled here, let me tell you one thing very clearly. Perhaps it was Eliot who broke this myth that a poem should have a certain limitation as style or as its words and diction or as its subject matter. It was under T.S. Eliot that suddenly we have all these so-called restrictions and boundaries broken. What do I mean by that? I mean that T.S. Eliot was one of those poets who showed that a poem can be on any subject, a poem can include any kind of a meter or rhyme, and any kind of diction and words. Try to understand. Earlier, we had a feeling that, well, when you are writing a poem, you must write some particularly poetic diction. You must use those words. But if a poem is to relate life properly, then can you really restrict the language of a poem? You cannot. Therefore, in Eliot, you find all different styles beautifully incorporated. Right? Now, he is one who contains too many diverse and often contradictory elements. I must highlight on this particular term, contradictory. This is a very important term for all of you. Try to understand why contradictory and why contradictory has something to do with modern. Actually, in modern day times, as all of you would agree with me, we are in a precarious situation, not because there is no choice, but rather we are often, bombarded with too many choices. And often we find that we land in a paradoxical situation where we don't know what to reject and what to embrace. Right? And perhaps a modern man is a man in whom you have here and there certain kind of contradictions. A strict man full of love. Isn't it a contradiction? Now, mark it, look at this here, coming back to Eliot. In him, we find too many diversity, too many contradictions, ranging from the atheism to orthodox faith. Atheism is not no belief in God, to orthodox faith, deep philosophical contemplation, to meaningless chatter. So at sometimes you find Eliot is philosophical, very profound. At some other moment, you find, well, might be one of the characters is saying something which apparently seems absurd, meaningless, just babbling, the tragic terror to farcical laughter. Immediately, on one hand, T.S. Eliot is our contemporary. You can always find a relevance with T.S. Eliot. You'll find when you read his poetry, you read his plays, you will find what he says is, yes, related to us even today. And yet, because he is, after all, a classic, why should we read T.S. Eliot even today? And why perhaps Eliot would be read years after? Why? Because he's beyond his times. There is something that is eternal. He diagnoses the spiritual malaise and the absurdity of existence. This is a very, very important point for all of you to remember and underline, because in both the poems that you have in your syllabus, Love Song of the Prufrock and The Hollow Men, in both of them, the theme is the spiritual malaise. The disease, malaise is disease. It's not that we are suffering from coronavirus alone. Our disease mainly is related to our spiritual dishonesty, right? Corruption, greed, excessive materialism, consumerism, and all this suddenly raising a very important question: why am I born, and what is the purpose of my life? That is the absurdity of existence. We find in Eliot, on one hand, a poet, and then on the other hand, a critique. Very interesting. So when you read Eliot, sometimes Eliot seems to be very difficult. Why? One of the reasons why Eliot seems very difficult to understand is that you have so many different strains in Eliot, right? On one hand, he is creating, and on the other hand, he is questioning, critiquing. And beautifully, these two components blend together almost inseparably. The critical intellect and the creative inspiration become one, completely fused. Under the great influence of metaphysical poets like John Donne and Andrew Marvell, Eliot brilliantly amalgamates the diverse materials. You know, you read already the metaphysical, so you know that what is metaphysical. In metaphysicals, the definition of the metaphysical, you all have read. It is violently yoking together, the diverse materials. And Eliot, once again, incorporates this. He forges diverse materials. And he doesn't do it mechanically. There must be some kind of a cohesion. Otherwise, he would not have really succeeded in creating poetry, or for that matter, any piece of art. Then I said in Eliot you have contradictions. And mark it in the next point, I mentioned that on one hand he is a romantic and on the other a classicist. Why? On one hand he says poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion, which is something different from what Wordsworth said. You know, Wordsworth said, what is the definition of poetry according to Wordsworth? Can anyone remember? Can anyone remember? Can anyone tell me what is the definition that Wordsworth gave?
So poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion and
yes, carry on, carry on.
Sorry, I forgot it.
Yes, somebody else. I mean, he has said it, a big part, a major part, he has said it correctly. He said, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of an emotion recollected in tranquility, right? So mark it here, Eliot is saying that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality. So he is going against the very subjectivity, which is the core of romanticism, but an escape from personality. So there, obviously, he is against romanticism. He doesn't seem to be a romantic. But here, Mark, in his famous essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, which is again, I think, there in the MS syllabus, he says, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. It's a very wonderful kind of a statement, right? Only a very disciplined person knows what it is to relax. A person who is very beautiful, only he can enjoy leisure properly, right? So that is what it seems to be a contradiction. But if you go into it, you understand that actually it's not a contradiction. It's a deeper meaning that is there hidden. In fact, fidelity to experience is the keynote of Eliot's creative work, right? So what is that fidelity? Fidelity is loyalty, devotion. That means if I am depicting an experience, I will do it with such dedication, with such commitment, right? That experience will be relived, that my readers would almost visualize and undergo the same feeling. That is the keynote of Eliot's creative work. It is his creative experience which enjoins, means combines spontaneously the contradictory elements of thought and feeling on one hand, intellect and emotion on the other, and reason and intuition on the third. See, reason is something which is always following the logical faculty. Intuition is something which never is dependent on reason, right? Thought and feeling, intellect and emotion. So one is the faculty of the mind, another is the faculty of the heart. And yet such is Eliot's creative experience that these two contradictory things beautifully get blended, right? You never question how is it possible. And in fact, I think all of you would agree with me that life is that. In life, we have reason on one hand, you have intuition on the other, right? Both are important, both are precious. Baudelaire's delineation of the vapidity of spirit, of the horror and boredom of loneliness, of envy. This envy is a very important word. You must all remember it. You must also note down this word, because this is that word which keeps on coming again and again when you read Prufrock or Eliot. What exactly is meant by envy? Envy is a tremendous kind of aversion. Aversion. I mean, you have seen the hollowness of the world, the hypocrisy of the world, the greed, the exploitation, right? The loneliness of the world. And all this has made you lose all your attraction for life and for the world. Therefore, there is a deep-seated kind of an aversion, right? Loss of interest. Loss of interest, okay? So you don't feel any interest. And Baudelaire first delineated this, which influenced Eliot. And when Eliot sat down to express his feelings of the contemporary modern day world, especially of the metropolis, the city-based life and culture, well, he could not find a better illustrator. So in his poems, again and again, you find this element of boredom, this element of loss of identity, this element of a tremendous sense of purposelessness, right? And in fact, this is what constitutes Eliot's own experience of modern malaise. Malaise, I already told you, means disease. From Lafarge, Eliot learns that poetry has its own logic, which may seem illogical to the conventional view. Yes, when you become creative, creativity has its own very peculiar, very subjective kind of a rationale, which a prosaic man perhaps would understand. So Eliot learns this from Lafarge. And this is related to what W.H. Auden talks about the poet's senses getting systematically deranged. When you become very, very passionate, aren't you suddenly almost mad? Mad in passion? You lose your sanity. You become cruel when you love something almost to the extent of madness. I don't know whether you are able to follow what I'm saying. Any very heightened kind of an activity cannot be undertaken unless you are completely merged into it, submerged into it. And you have already read Wordsworth's famous poem, Tintin Abbey, where Wordsworth is talking about that kind of suspension of all your senses, right? It's a meditative state. A creator, a poet, an artist, or anybody who does something so passionately, with such commitment and involvement, that all the surroundings suddenly stop and cease to exist, that's a kind of insanity. And insanity, and yet perhaps better than sanity, because that creates, right? In Eliot, we often get at the truths of experience through cracks in the consciousness. Somebody cannot be properly analyzed and dissected if you just look at the broad things, the big things that he or she does. তোমরা জানো, এক জায়গায় রবীন্দ্রনাথ বলেছেন যে যদি কোনো মানুষকে চিনতে হয় তাহলে তার ছোট ছোট জিনিসগুলোকে দেখো, ওই ছোট ছোট জিনিস ওই মানুষটা কেমন করে করে। যখন বাড়িতে বিয়ে হয়, যখন কোনো গৃহপ্রবেশ ঘটে, রাইট, তখন আমরা সবাই ভদ্র, তখন আমরা সবাই ঘরটাকে সাজাই, আমন্ত্রণ জানাই, আমরা খাতির করি। That's not the real me. The real me is what I am in my day-to-day life, in the smaller things that I do, right? in a not so consequential situation, how do I react? How do I tolerate? Right? So Eliot's characters, or the truths that he wants to communicate and manifest or reveal, they can only be known by the cracks in the consciousness. Try to understand this. Cracks means a kind of loss of sanity. Loss of sanity. At a one particular moment, a man has lost his sanity. A man has become almost mad and he starts shouting or raving or raging, complaining. Right? Or a man might even become extremely depressed, lonely. Right? So those are the moments when you can perhaps know that man better. Those are sudden revelations. Eliot's protagonists like Prufrock, Sweeney, Gerontion, Tiresias, these are some very important characters that Eliot created. They are characters who are bored with the life of the flesh. And one thing you must all know, what is this getting bored with the life of the flesh? This is too much, chasing too much sensual satisfaction. Even today, you would all agree with me. What is our interpretation of pleasure? Tell me, frankly, what do we do? Once the exam is over, do we celebrate by writing a poem? Hardly. Do we really go up on the rooftop, lie down under the sky, and start enjoying the calmness or the magnitude? No. We have a peculiar notion that if I am happy, well, if I want to get pleasure, what should I do? In one way or the other, I must satisfy my sensual desires. I will drink, I'll make a party, all those things. And the modern day world is a world of consumerism, is a world of only material comforts. And this all is related to this life of the flesh. And when you have an excess of that, you feel suddenly a sense of, satiety. Saturation point has come and you feel extremely bored. You are no more attracted to doing all those. And in the poem Prufrock, you will find that beautifully projected. They tend to be, in fact, each of consciousness coiling and recoiling upon itself. So how are these characters created by Eliot? They are not presented in a conventional manner. Rather, we are led into the very inside of these characters' mind. What kind of thoughts are crisscrossing their mind? Right? Their feelings, sometimes which remain unexpressed. Okay, so consciousness coiling and recoiling upon itself. They properly portray these characters. We often find Eliot's presenting an extremely sensitive character at the center of the poem. And this character binds all diverse and desperate objects. Sometimes we just do not understand how is a poem by Eliot properly cohesive. Well, how is that cohesion achieved and attained? So we have to understand that that cohesion to a great extent is attained because you have a central character. You have a character, and all that is happening around him or her, are in one way or the other the projection of his or her mind, the truths, the realities of the time of life. Eliot's entire poem is a projection of this central protagonist's consciousness, his moods, reflections, and reactions. to the created situation, emotion or lack of emotion. And that is the reason that many of us find Eliot's poem very difficult to understand, because it's not a very conventional kind of a description only, right? You have to be very sensitive, you have to be very alert, then only you will understand these very subtle, minute kind of reactions and moods and fluctuations. Eliot's heroes are like Henry James's, isolated, alienated, withdrawn into their own selves, always suffering from a fear of harsh realities and vulgarities of life. And I think many of you, even at this young age, would agree with me that sometimes even we have a sense of alienation. We feel very lonely, right? We just don't know how to cope up with different kind of harsh realities and vulgarities, obscenities of life. Lafarge also provided Eliot with a model of a protagonist, showed a manner of using the urban setting, demonstrated how to create images pregnant with irony. Eliot's adoption of irregular stanza pattern and rhythm, roughly following the curve of ordinary conversation, ironic playfulness, couched in the form of dialogue or monologue at cross purposes, needed a form of disrupted blank verse. Blank verse is a verse in which you don't need to follow a particular fixed kind of a rhyme scheme, right? And I told you right at the beginning that Eliot wrote poetry in such a manner where he has incorporated almost all different situations. You will have a sentence comprising only of one word. You will have a sentence which keeps on rolling and rolling and rolling like the wave of an ocean. That's life. That's how our feeling is. Broken at points to make room for grave magniloquence of sentiments. Magniloquence is where you become very ecstatic. You are expressing something very serious, something very grave and solemn. And this cross-beading of the verse form is what culminated in Prufrock and the Portrait of a Lady, because we have Prufrock in our syllabus. While dealing with the textual analysis of Prufrock, I will point it out to you. So then you will understand why is Eliot called one of the masters of the modernism. Eliot's method was not simply to relate, but to make readers cooperate by richness of his references. It's a very important point. If you are to understand Eliot, you cannot simply remain a passive reader only. You have to get involved. That is what is meant by cooperate. So you have to be a partner, right? Under the influence of the Imagist movement led by people like T.E. Hume, Ezra Pound, and W.B. Yeats, Eliot insisted upon the need and adequacy of organic forms, something new, not just carrying on with the old fashions and old forms and structures, using the language and rhythm, mark that, of everyday speech. So that is colloquialism, right? So you need not be artificially poetic all the time. Incorporated into poetry objects from contemporary scene. So anything can be incorporated under the sun. You don't have limited objects and things on which poetry must be written. No, Eliot includes and incorporates every type of words, every type of objects, and rejecting deliberately popular subjects. No cliche, right? Eliot's poetic technique imposes a form on his experience communicated in the poem. So the technique sometimes creates one definite special kind of a form in which the meaning becomes clear. And then the last important point for us to discuss today is the objective correlative. This is a term which is used by Eliot, and we have all to understand what exactly is meant by objective correlative. TS Eliot used this phrase to describe a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion that the poet feels and hopes to evoke in the reader. Let me simplify it. So what is this objective correlative? Eliot, suppose, has something to convey, a very strong emotion, or something very strong passion he wants to communicate or convey. And to convey that emotion, Eliot would bring in different kind of objects. Mark that, a set of objects, not one object, right? A number of objects, different situations, different events, apparently perhaps not related. But because all of them are directly, indirectly, in one way or the other, related to the central protagonist, to the person who has been undergoing that feeling or experience, right? So all different things, all different situations, all different moods, they collectively make you somewhat understand the passion, the emotion, the feeling of the character. This is what is the objective correlative. Correlative means which relates, correlates, right? Like, if I'm mad, what happens? I might do something irrational, illogical. I might suddenly say some very strong words. I might I might burst into laughter. I might start weeping suddenly without any plausible cause or cause. So what is happening? All these are therefore objective correlatives, telling you about a very stressed mental state. And why that mental state? Might be one particular reason or the other. So in Eliot, again and again, we have to find that objective correlative and understand that central emotion, that particular emotion that the poet wants to convey. There must be a positive connection between the emotion the poet is trying to express and the object, image, or situation in the poem that helps to convey that emotion to the reader. So he is talking about a connection, that is a correlation. And then Eliot blames Shakespeare. He says that in Hamlet, Shakespeare has failed. He says Hamlet was an artistic failure because Hamlet's intense emotions overwhelmed the author's attempts to express them through an objective correlative. I don't know how many of you have read Hamlet, or how many of you know exactly what happened in Hamlet, how Hamlet almost also became mad. Eliot says, well, the very strong emotion that you find in Hamlet is not properly conveyed to the reader through this objective correlatives because the author himself was overwhelmed. Eliot felt that Shakespeare was unable to provoke the audience to feel, mark that, this is that important word, to feel as Prince Hamlet did through images, actions, and characters, and instead only inadequately describe his emotional state through the play's dialogue. Eliot's theory of the objective correlative is closely related to the imagist movement, which I just mentioned a moment ago. So these are some very important points in the introduction, which all of you have to understand and keep in mind if at all you have to understand the text properly. And I already pointed it out to you that Eliot's poetry is different from other poetry. And if you cannot understand these very important issues which I tried to point out, well, it will be difficult, in fact, to understand what Eliot is trying to do in the two poems, Love Song of the Blue Frog, as well as The Hollow. So there I stop my deliberation.